All right, everybody, we are back for section 15 of our investigations course. This is going to be a relatively short section just on terrorism from an investigations point of view. So we'll start off with our funny picture of the day. If you haven't seen The Dark Knight, it is one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. Heath Ledger is absolutely brilliant as the Joker. Now, terrorism. Terrorism is a really, really rough subject. For one thing, it's dang near impossible to define. You ask 100 different law enforcement agents or even law enforcement agencies or people who make dictionaries, and they'll give you 100 different definitions for what terrorism actually is. And every single one is going to exclude some people that probably should be included under terrorism, and it's going to include some people who probably shouldn't be included under the definition of terrorism. So it's a really difficult thing to kind of nail down and define and figure out kind of what is and what isn't terrorism. And there's always probably going to be debates about, oh, such and such crime happened. Does that qualify as terrorism or not? Now, one of the things we can say is that there's two different kinds of terrorism when it comes to any given country. So I'm in the United States, so I'm going to use that as the example. But there's international terrorism and there's domestic terrorism. International terrorism is terrorism that comes from somewhere else. Somebody from another country comes to this one to commit some kind of terrorist act. So examples would be 9/11, right? The attackers on 9/11 were mostly from Saudi Arabia. And of course, were being financed by Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. International terrorism, a lot of times it's very kind of big name events like 9/11. I mean, obviously 9/11 is probably the biggest, most famous terrorist attack, at least in United States history. But they are much, 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 much more rare than domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism is, terrorist attacks from within the country. And domestic terrorism is the vast majority of all terrorism, no matter whose definition you use to define what is terrorism and what isn't. But a great example of domestic terrorism here in the United States was Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing from the mid-90s. I think it was 1995. Timothy McVeigh wanted to start a race war, and so got inspired by a book called The Turner Diaries to fill a moving van full of explosives and drive it up next to a federal building in Oklahoma City, set a timer and walk away, and then it blew up, took down half the building, killed, I think, 168 people. So that's a great example of domestic terrorism. I believe it's still the second largest or second most deadly terrorist attack in the United States, second only to 9/11. But then domestic terrorism happens all the time. As I record this, just a couple days ago, a LGBT plus nightclub was just shot up and a bunch of people died in a terrorist attack. There was a church that got attacked in South Carolina a few years ago. There was a theater showing The Dark Knight, as I mentioned on the last slide, that got attacked. There was a concert in Las Vegas where somebody got an elevated position and shot a ton of people. So those kinds of domestic attacks are way more common than international terrorism, and that's true basically whatever country you're talking about. If there's a terrorist attack in any country, odds are it's coming from a group or a person from that country itself. Now, some of the major terrorist groups around the world. So these are the kind of non-United States ones. And of course, these are obviously focused on the Middle East. Because right now, because of lots and lots of reasons involving the history of the Middle East and colonization and religion and all these different conflicts and issues and all these things, kind of the world focus of terrorism in the past probably 50 years or more has been the Middle East. Now, there's lots of different groups around the Middle East. There's Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, which is kind of the native areas of Israel. There's Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan and that area. And then, of course, there's ISIL, also called ISIS, in Iraq and Syria. Um, and many in the West kind of see all these groups as just kind of generic Islamic terrorists who don't like America and the West and Israel and want to kill people from those countries. But that really misses out on a lot of the kind of specific uh, goals and aims and methods and motivations of these groups, which can be vastly different. Even though we in the West like to lump them all together as just, oh, Middle Eastern terrorists, they can be hugely different. And one of the things we need to look at when looking at the basic differences between these groups and their goals and their aims and their motivations is the major division in Islam. Right? So if you're watching this, you're probably from either the United States or some other Western country, and you understand that there's divisions within Christianity, right? There's Catholicism and Protestantism, right? And you can divide that lots of other ways too, but they're both kind of under the umbrella of Christianity. They just do it differently, right? Catholics do it different from Lutherans, who do it different from Methodists, who do it different from Mormons. But they're all under that kind of big umbrella of Christianity. Islam, it's the same thing. But the major divide there is Sunni and Shia. So the Islamic religion was started by a guy named Muhammad in about 600 AD. But when he died, there was kind of a power struggle for who was going to continue on this religion. And one group thought it should be one person, and another group thought it should be another person, and that was the divide between Sunni and Shia way back, 1,300 years ago. And they've been kind of not very friendly ever since. And one of the, there's been lots of wars and terrorism and all kinds of things in the Middle East from one Middle Eastern country or group to another, just based on this Sunni versus Shia divide, similar to how there was a vast Christian terrorist pattern of terrorism in Northern Ireland between Catholic and Protestant. Same kind of thing, but much older and much more kind of impactful and a larger geographic area when we're dealing with Islam in the Middle East. Now, domestic terrorism. Again, this is the vast majority of all terrorism in any country, but again, we're going to be focusing on the United States just because that's where I'm from. But domestic terrorism, there's lots of different groups. There's the KKK is one of the oldest still operating groups, although it's no longer one kind of monolith like it was 100 years ago. There's lots of different groups that claim to be the true KKK, and they're all relatively small and relatively spread out and don't work well together, but they all claim to be the KKK, which stands for the Ku Klux Klan, which was formed after the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, by Southerners who wanted to kind of continue fighting against the ideas of integration and, they wanted to fight against ending slavery. So the KKK is very much not only anti-African American, but also anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic. Basically anything that's not a white, Protestant, straight person is the enemy, according to the KKK. One of the big rises in domestic terrorism is militias. We've seen a huge rise in the number of militia groups around the country just in the past 10 years. These are people who are kind of, training as groups for various warfare scenarios. Generally, they're, far right, anti-government. They're going to come for our guns kind of groups. And a lot of the domestic terrorists that have committed really horrible acts of terrorism have spent at least some time in at least one of these militia groups. Abortion extremists are always an issue. abortion clinics around the country are frequently shot at, bombed, burned down, attacked, threatened, um, all kinds of different terrorist either threats or actual terrorist actions happen at abortion clinics all over the country all the time. And it, in fact, is so common that it even rarely makes the news. QAnon is another big driver of modern terrorist attacks. If you don't know, QAnon is a conspiracy theory that started on a message board by someone calling themselves Q, and they made all kinds of claims about satanic ritual in Washington D.C. and politicians who are pedophiles and eat babies and all these kind of crazy, insane things. And there's been numerous terrorist attacks based on these conspiracy theories, the largest of which was probably the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, which is driven by QAnon conspiracy theory. But there was also an attack on a pizza restaurant in 2016, I think it was. Somebody went in and shot up a pizza restaurant because he believed the QAnon conspiracy theory that said there was a basement in that building where high-level politicians were holding satanic rituals and killing children. And he believed he was going in to rescue these children, only to find out that not only was the conspiracy theory not true, the building didn't even have a basement. And I believe, luckily, in that case, nobody died, but he did shoot a lot of, lots of property destruction and so on and so forth with that attack. During Vietnam, there were a lot of terrorist attacks, kind of in an anti-war sentiment. In fact, there was a relatively famous one. My father was attending the University of Wisconsin at the time, and while he was attending the university, there was a bombing on campus where they were trying to attack the building on campus where they had like the military research stuff. It's been a few years since he told me the story, but they planted a bomb just to kind of attack the military connection with the university. It went off in the very early morning hours because they didn't want to actually hurt any people. They just wanted to destroy the property. But I think they actually ended up killing some. Again, I could be misremembering. But there were a lot of other associated attacks involved with anti-Vietnam War protesters trying to essentially terrorize the United States government into leaving the war in Iraq. And then, of course, there's eco-terrorism. This was a much bigger deal 30, 40 years ago, but it is still around. But this is where people will burn down construction sites or attack animal testing facilities and release animals into the wild so they won't be experimented on anymore. Or, it can be even as simple as, just vandalizing what people see as environmental blights on the landscape. But essentially, these are people who are fighting for the environment, which is a good thing, but they're using violence, threats, terrorism, bombs, arson, that kind of thing in which to do it, which is not a good thing. So how do people commit terrorism? Well, there's lots and lots and lots of ways. There are tons of different ways to commit terrorism. As I said, there's arson, there's guns, there's all kinds of, in 9/11 they used airplanes. But some of the classics, some of the more and more, not necessarily more common, but more destructive and more famous and more worrying are things like explosives. And there's lots of different ways to use explosives in terrorist attacks. The easiest is the IED, the improvised explosive device, a homemade bomb, right? Many years ago, I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago, but it was probably more like 10 or 15 years ago, There was somebody planting improvised explosive devices or just pipe bombs in mailboxes around the country, and his goal was to plant a pipe bomb in such a way that when you mapped it out on a map of the United States, it made a big smiley face. And he got kind of both eyes and then a little bit of the mouth, I think, before he was caught and arrested. But he was just planting improvised explosive devices. They're also very commonly seen back during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The terrorists who wanted to attack Americans would plant IEDs by the side of a road, wait for an American convoy to drive by, and then set off the bomb, trying to explode, some of the vehicles. Vehicle-based bombs. This is where you just take anything from a moving van to a plane to a regular car, fill it as full of explosives as you can, drive it to where you want to explode, and then either explode it with you inside, which is a form of suicide bombing, or just park it, walk away, and set some kind of timer. The Oklahoma City bombing was a vehicle bomb, obviously. 9/11, I guess you could call those vehicle-borne explosives. But there's also, there was an attack in Austin, Texas, just a couple of miles away from where my family was living, where somebody flew a plane into an IRS building, and I want to say killed 2 people, including himself, or in addition to himself. So planes, explosives packed into cars and trucks, those are all vehicle-borne bombs. And then if the person doing the bombing dies during the attack, it's called a suicide bombing, right? So sometimes they're in a vehicle that explodes. Sometimes they're wearing, explosives on their person, whether it's a vest or a belt or, whatever. But they'll go into a very crowded place, intending to cause as much damage as they can, and then explode themselves, taking as many people as they can with them. Secondary attacks are always a big concern with explosives. There was a movie, and it was a fictional movie, and I can't remember what it was called. But basically, in the beginning of the movie, somebody sets off a car bomb in some foreign country, Eastern Europe or Middle Eastern country or something, I can't remember. And then, of course, everybody rushes in, the first responders, the ambulance crews, the investigators, everybody rushes in to try to save lives and investigate the attack and figure out what happened. And then something happens, and one of the characters in the movie is like, oh God, we just gave them a really amazing target. And then a secondary explosion detonates and kills all those first responders, all the investigators, all the military personnel that were there. So it was the second attack was really the one that the terrorists wanted to commit. It was, the first attack was just to draw those people in. One of the big worries, the big nightmare scenarios, is if terrorists get their hands on WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. And there are 3 kind of forms of weapons of mass destruction. There's nuclear, biological, and chemical. And there have already been attacks with biological and chemical. Luckily, they weren't nearly as kind of powerful or impactful as they could have been. Soon after 9/11, there was somebody, and I believe they still haven't been caught, who was mailing around anthrax to various famous people, media personalities, politicians, etc. It was also in Japan. There was a chemical weapons attack with sarin gas. But luckily, the sarin gas was not the most pure, and the delivery method wasn't the best. It still killed a lot of people, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it kind of could have been if they had worked a little bit harder on both the gas itself and the delivery method. But of course, then there's also the nuclear option, which it would be relatively surprising if terrorists got their hands on an actual nuclear bomb and caused some kind of detonation. But even if they just got their hands on enough radioactive material, they could attach that to a regular bomb, explode that in, downtown somewhere city, and just spread radiation over a very wide area, which would cause untold, not only loss of life, but also economic impact. So nuclear is definitely a huge fear, even if it's not a full-blown nuclear bomb. Cyber terrorism is obviously a growing issue with the connection of more and more and more things to computerized networks. But cyber terrorism can include things like, using only a computer from remote access, you can do things like blow up power plants by messing with the spinning of the turbine blades. You can cause oil pipelines to leak oil all over sensitive areas. You can shut down hospitals so that people can't get care and die. There's all kinds of ways you can cause physical destruction and death using only cyber means from remote attacks. And then, of course, maybe the biggest fear with terrorism is other. What have we not thought of yet? One of the reasons 9/11 was such a hugely successful, I hate to use the word successful, hugely impactful, hugely damaging, hugely destructive terrorist attack was because we hadn't really thought of it. We using planes to fly into buildings, like, that was something that we just absolutely were not prepared for. And that was one of the reasons why it was so huge and destructive, was because we weren't prepared at all. So what else aren't we preparing for? What else have we not really thought of? What else are the terrorists preparing for that we're just completely not expecting at all? That's the big scary thing. Anyway, that is the end of our very short section on terrorism. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next section.